the Lex working group, which is looking at Lex schema, feeds into something that could be even more important going forward, and that's text to graph query, because graph query languages are a big part of what the GDC does. Okay, we're looking at standard graph query languages to foster innovation in the field. In the same way a benchmark might foster innovation in the field, having standard query languages will, obviously do the same thing.
Welcome to GraphGeeks in Discussion. I'm Amy Hodler. Today we're diving into the Graph Data Council, formerly known as the Linked Data Benchmark Council. Now, they've had an outsized impact on the industry as the creators of vendor-neutral benchmarks for graph databases and linked data. Now, we're lucky to be joined today by Henry Gabb, who's the chair of GDC. Now, Henry has a really impressive background with over 20 years as a senior principal engineer at Intel. He was focused on high-performance computing, big data, and AI, as well as cancer research with leadership roles in scientific computing for the U.S. Department of Defense. Henry also has doctorates in both molecular genetics and information sciences, so it's fair to say he deeply understands the intersection of data, performance, and complexity. Welcome, Henry, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Amy.
Yeah. So before we get started, Henry, I always like to share with our audience how people have gotten into graphs. When did you first come across graphs and how did you get into them?
It's a fun question because I was working in Intel labs at the time, and most of my work was for parallel algorithms. And if you know anything about parallel graph algorithms, they're notoriously difficult, or graph algorithms themselves are notoriously difficult to parallelize. Um, and so Tim Matson and I were looking at what research could we fund in academia to advance this problem. So if we were to do a research program in academia, say on a 3 to 5 year time horizon, what labs are doing the best work in parallel graph algorithms, mostly graph analytics? This was before I, had ever really been exposed to graph databases or graph query languages. That came later. My initial interest was graph analytics, okay, and how to make that go faster, mostly by parallelizing these, almost inherently serial algorithms. And so we built this research program in academia that I think it helped advance the field. Okay, parallel graph algorithms are not quite as, daunting as they used to be or they used to seem.
Yeah, absolutely. I love the whole algorithm space. So always fun to meet a fellow graph algorithm um, uh, fanatic, so to speak. Uh, so let's talk a little bit about the history of LDBC, now GDC, and what the original benchmarking was all about. A little bit of history there for people that aren't familiar.
Okay, well, the Linked Data Benchmark Council, okay, benchmark being the operative word back then, it was formed or registered in the UK back in 2013. And uh, its goal was to foster innovation in the graph space, whether it was graph analytics, graph databases, graph querying, using standard benchmarks. And so I think the initial crop of benchmarks were the social network benchmark. If you're doing graph computations on a social network, whether it's a Twitter graph or a Facebook graph, uh, graph analytics, which was my initial interest, because if you look at the LDBC Graphalytics benchmark and the list of authors, okay, there are authors from Intel, authors from multiple vendors, multiple companies who were interested in really a vendor neutral benchmark that they could use to compare uh, the performance of graph analytics algorithms on their hardware. So initially it was the semantic publishing benchmark. I can't forget that one, which was a benchmark for RDF engines.
I see.
So RDF engine benchmarking, graph analytics benchmarking, social network benchmarking, and we have since added FinBench. Um,
Nice.
So for financial services, because one of the key uses of graph computation in the financial sector is for fraud detection. And even though a financial network is in a sense a social network, or in some sense, your reason for analyzing it is very different. You're looking for money laundering, you're looking for fraud. You have, in many cases, real-time latency requirements and latency thresholds that have to be met that aren't as critical in a social network analysis.
So, cool question to follow up on that since we're talking about FinBench and financial networks. Well, first, I think people could benefit from understanding like how large is of an organization is this, but also the impact on the industry because if you're using this for financial networks and benchmarking, why are people doing that, and what's the impact on the industry in general?
The industry in general, it's harder for me to quantify or even qualify that. I can look at who is submitting audit or who's publishing audited benchmark results for FinBench. And, that's a common one where our members will, request an audit because that's another characteristic of a benchmarking organization that you have to have fair use provisions so that people aren't using your benchmarks in in an underhanded way to gain a competitive advantage so that they can't be gamed. And so we know based on who is publishing audited results where they come to us and say, we would like an audit of our FinBench results because we intend to publish. And so that would be the best way I could quantify that if people are publishing audited results for a particular benchmark, you are having an influence.
I
Because the
see.
benchmark
And
is time consuming, it's expensive,
yeah,
it requires some effort to do it, and so you do it if you think it will provide a competitive advantage.
yeah. And having been involved in some of those projects on the vendor side, actually, years ago, I know that it's something that the end clients of those vendors, the customers of those vendors, look at to try to get um, a level playing field to understand different aspects of graphs. Is that something that do you ever hear from end users of graph technology, or is it mostly graph vendors and providers that interact with the council?
It's mostly our members.
Okay.
So it's mostly the members who interact with us because to do an audited benchmark, to request an audit, you essentially have to be a member.
I see. I see. Okay.
Now,
And since we're
let me
talking about
if I can clarify just for a second, the fair use provisions of the GDC benchmarks, do allow people to take them, run them, and even publish some results for research purposes.
oh, I see.
But for a complete benchmark with a complete set of results, that requires an audit.
Okay. So it's something that researchers use as well. I assume to inform work that they're doing and maybe developing, kind of new methods and approaches.
That's right. We don't want to close off the benchmarks for research purposes.
Actually, that makes a lot of sense. Since we were talking about members, can you tell us a little bit about your members? And I think you said you recently did a survey, to kind of understand, what their goals are as well.
We have, let's see, 20 plus members and a lot more individual associate members. And it ranges all the way from, like I said, non voting individual members all the way up to very large corporations. And so it's a tiered membership fee. Anyone can join and can be an individual associate member, but you can also be an individual voting member. A membership tier for nonprofits and then for-profit companies based on the size of the organization. But we have 20 plus voting members and a lot more
And
non-voting members.
yeah. And for what's the motivation, I guess, for your non-voting members and maybe your lower tier lower responsibility, lower tier members?
Well, to go back to your previous question about the survey, the member survey we did earlier this year, many of the members said they simply wanted a seat at the table. So to hear these graph discussions among uh, vendors who have a vested interest in graph computation, so having a seat at the table for those discussions is valuable to some members.
It's interesting you say, just hearing the conversations and, becoming informed on, what the performance comparisons you're going to have are important. It just reminds me that there's a lot of value in just talking to people and just listening to conversation that you don't get out of asking ChatGPT or Gemini or something else. What's out there on the internet. There's a lot that happens in conversations that I think is just highly valuable. So
Right.
that makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Well, I know Dennis, it's a shame you missed it, but Dennis was at our technical user community meeting, and there was just a lot of energy at the meeting this year, a lot of attendance, and a lot of interesting topics discussed.
For those of you who haven't met Dennis Arora yet, he's our innovation lead at GraphGeeks. Attended one of the user meetings, the GDC user meetings just recently, and I think energy is definitely what I would say came out when he was explaining how informative it was, how much of a nice community to talk through new ideas, and just the understanding, even just getting that second party through him, understanding some of the direction of the, I would say, some of the leaders in the graph community. So we were talking a lot about benchmarks right now, but to me, it's more than just benchmarks. At least these conversations kind of span direction of graph communities and direction of research. And direction of some very large providers in the space as well, and so yeah, I feel like it's so much bigger than benchmarks itself, which I know we'll talk about here in a second. I do want to circle back though to the member survey. What else either surprised you or came out of the member survey?
See, surprising things, and I will say before I forget, we're going to publish the results of the survey. So we've written up the survey results in a report that we are going to publish if it isn't published already. Okay, it will go up on the GDC website. But the surprising things, I would have to say, possibly a de-emphasis on monolithic benchmarks in favor of microbenchmarks with sort of a lower barrier to entry, that they're easier to maintain, easier to run, easier to get definitive results. But also, some members said what matters more than the benchmarks is the data. Okay, the data sets that feed into them and synthetic data generation that gives them some control over the size of the input, because companies have different graph requirements. Some companies deal with very, very large
Oh,
graphs, trillions of nodes I've seen in some sectors, or at least that's their target, all the way down to companies that deal mainly with small graphs. At any given moment, it might only have 100 nodes. Okay, but it changes
yeah.
very frequently. So you have the big graphs that don't change as much or as often. You have small graphs that change, in the millisecond time scale. Um, so for those members, they're more interested in synthetic data generation.
Should I infer focus on data, synthetic data generation, and micro benchmarks is part of the name change? So moving to Graph Data Council.
Yes, at our member policy meeting last December, uh, um, one of our members suggested that because the benchmarks themselves are not the main focus. Okay, it's the graph query languages that are becoming really important. The data sets that are important, possibly synthetic data generation is really important. Maybe we're not strictly the linked data benchmark council anymore. Maybe we need something more broad. And among the members, the Graph Data Council was the agreed upon name because we're graph data. It still encompasses graph query languages. It still encompasses benchmarking, but it's kind of a bigger umbrella than just the Linked Data Benchmark Council, and it's more reflective of what we do and what we're likely to be doing going
Yeah.
forward.
I was gonna ask, this also points in potential new directions. So what things should people be looking forward to maybe 2026, maybe end of the year this year? Yeah, what directions or new projects are you working on?
Well, I'm hoping to see more micro benchmark proposals. So we do have at least one micro benchmark proposal on the table. But what's really going to be important is the work we're doing for Lex schema in attempting to say unify property graphs and RDF. But
Wow.
that
Okay.
but see that
Hold on a second. Hold on a second. That's a big deal. I love Henry. I just love how you kind of you just say that in passing and move on. First, what does LEX stand for? And tell me more about this potential unification, because that seems like it would be difficult.
Okay, well, I'll go back. It reflects my bias. Okay, your observation
Okay.
reflects my bias, and my bias is still toward benchmarking because that was where I started with the organization. But the Lex working group, which is looking at Lex schema, feeds into something that could be even more important going forward, and that's text to graph query. Because graph query languages are a big part of what the GDC does. Okay, we're looking at standard graph query languages to foster innovation in the field. In the same way a benchmark might foster innovation in the field, having standard query languages will, obviously do the same thing. But if you have a schema, okay, a schema allows you to do things with AI, text to graph query, that can I convert a natural language query into, say, a GQL or Cipher or some other graph query language and just have AI do it. But I'm pretty sure uh, I'm not as technically up on what's required, but I'm pretty certain schema are going to be required if we're going to have something like text to graph query.
Yeah, I would say in my experience, uh, schemas in that workflow always produce better results. Required is I would say an air quotes. Well, it depends on if you want to have good results, which who doesn't?
Right,
So
right,
it'd probably run without. But yeah, absolutely, it's gonna be the way people operate, I think.
right. And so having this unification and here's another reflecting my bias. Okay, you said one of my doctorates is in information science, and so I was in grad school versed in RDF, versed in Sparkle, and while I appreciate RDF, okay, I appreciate ontologies, the information scientist in me feels compelled to say that. Okay, I in practice, in a practical sense, in practice, the work I've done, property graphs just have always been better. Okay, they allowed me to get to work and make progress more quickly than RDF.
But I'm gonna challenge in the what I've seen. So my very first graph I got involved in was RDF, and I now do probably more property graph. But the RDF definitely has its place, and
Right,
especially if you need rigor and a lot of rigorous inference, government or any kind of regulatory work. However, I think what I'm hearing from you, and what I believe as well, which is why I'm excited about this work, is that they both have their place, and they may both be extremely useful at the same company for different purposes of working with graph data. And so if you can have a way to go from one to the other, depending on either what you're using or where you are in the workflow, I think that would excite a lot of people, to be able to do that. So you can use the best of both worlds for the, whatever the task is at hand.
Right. And that is definitely my hope because
Mm,
when I was still at Intel, I had customers who were heavily invested in RDF.
mm,
I've also had customers who had just moved directly to property graphs. So, I saw both sides of it and I can see the strength of
yeah,
both. And I
yeah.
completely agree with you of the strengths of RDF. But there's a practical side of me that you've got to get working quickly, and property graphs, are help to do that. But to see them unified, yeah, I'm really excited about, seeing the kind of unification that could happen.
Yeah, that's exciting. So, thinking about okay, we're talking a little bit about moving forward, and especially with some of these new directions. If people want to be more involved, either whether they're a vendor, a graph, providing a graph solution or not. So, maybe you're a large enterprise and you just want to be informed of what's going on. How should they get involved? What are some baby steps? What do you recommend?
My first baby step would be join as an associate member. Okay, get your seat at the table, come talk to us. It could just be, say a researcher, an academic researcher interested in a single algorithm. And, I know researchers who are that focused and
Mm,
they want to experiment with new ways of doing a particular graph computation. Um, you may not want to pay for a voting membership, but having a seat at the table is still valuable. And a lot of members did say that in the survey. We want a seat at the table because, especially for an academic researcher, we want to know what matters to industry. Because if we're doing research in an area that is of interest to them, it's an avenue for collaboration, for testing, um, possibly for student internships.
mm,
It's a
absolutely.
good relationship to have.
Okay. So if so people can sign up via your website, is that correct? Kind of find a little detail on there?
That would be the place to begin, to look at the memberships, and then it would just be a matter of, contacting us, expressing a desire to join. The LDBC.org will still be in use because that's still a branded and trademarked name. So the benchmarks themselves still exist under the LDBC trademark.
Okay. All
Uh,
right.
so
Wonderful.
that domain will still be in effect. We might have other domain names, but they'll all map to the LDBC.org.
Okay. Great. That's easy. I was hoping so because it's easy to remember and find for me when I'm looking for you. So, anything else that you want to make sure people who are listening, remember, or if they're new to the group, kind of key points that you want them to walk away with.
I guess we've covered a lot, but I guess it would be the broadness of it. Okay, whether you're just interested in specific graph algorithms, whether you're interested in query languages, benchmarking it, if it has to do with graph processing, um, there's a pretty good chance that the Graph Data Council is also interested in it and has members who will discuss it.
Awesome. Well, you heard it here. Go to ldbc.org, sign up, follow along, get your seat at the table. Also, GraphGeeks and GDC will be doing more together. We're very supportive of vendor neutral platforms in general and just collaboration. So, thank you, Henry. Really appreciate your time today.
Well, thanks for the invitation. It was fun.